In a palace near London, surrounded by servants and opulence in the mid-1500s, Edward Tudor is the 9-year-old pampered heir to the throne of England. Not far from London Bridge, 9-year-old Tom Canty lives in one room with 5 relatives, including his father and grandmother, from whom he gets regular thrashings. Some of you will recognize this literary character as Mark Twain's in his novel, The Prince and the Pauper. Twain calls it a tale for young people of all ages. And in it, Tom's dream is to see a real prince. One day, having been sent out to beg again, Tom ends up at Westminster, and his dream comes true. He sees a real prince. And then the prince sees him. He invites Tom inside the palace, and they begin to exchange stories about their lives. And as they do, each desires the others. For a lark, they exchange clothes, and then they stand in front of a huge mirror and look at themselves. They are shocked at how each looks exactly like the other. The prince then steps out of the room for a moment to go reprimand a guard, but in Tom's rags, he's taken for an intruder and thrown out of the palace gates. Tom, left inside and dressed like a prince, assumes the role of one, while Edward's life is turned upside down. His life becomes one of hunger, grief, insult, and oppression. These are the new normals as he tries again and again to get back home. Along the way, he tells everyone who he is, but no one believes him. The death of Edward's father, King Henry VIII, turns him from a prince into a king, but that doesn't help his situation. Well, at long last, on Coronation Day, seconds before the crown would be laid on the head of the pauper, Tom Canty, the true king appears at the back of Westminster Abbey, and he begins walking down the aisle announcing his title. Tom is so relieved. He kneels and he pledges his obedience to King Edward VI, but no one else believes that someone dressed in rags could be their sovereign leader. 15 centuries earlier, northeast of Galilee, almost in Syria, Peter, James, and John were invited by their leader up a high mountain. Now, the mountains in Caesarea Philippi aren't as tall even as our Mill Mountain, but the summit didn't need to be high in altitude. On top of most mountains in Scripture, one is closer to heaven and therefore closer to God. Some people call these thin places, where the membrane between heaven and earth is thin, sometimes even permeable. Atop this mountain, the disciples saw Jesus transfigured. Was it the closer presence of God that made him radiate dazzling light? And then suddenly, 2 other beings appear with Jesus. The disciples recognized Moses and Elijah, 2 prophets who also knew the rejection about which Jesus was just speaking 6 days earlier. Peter, this same Peter, said, "You are the Messiah," 6 days earlier, the Son of the living God. And with an implied acceptance of these titles, from that time forward, Jesus began to show his disciples that he had to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and legal experts, and that he had to be killed and raised on the third day. Wait, what? Well, now on the mountain, we see God's glory dazzling us through Jesus. So he must have been mistaken about that suffering part, right? Peter seems to want to freeze this glorious brilliance for everyone to see. He offers to build a shelter or a tabernacle for each of these three prophets. He's thinking back perhaps to the Exodus time when God's presence was like a fiery cloud. And it traveled near that ancient shelter or tabernacle that housed the Ark of the Covenant. So could new shelters be built to retain this holy moment? God shatters Peter's plan with an interruption, a bright cloud that overshadows them, and from the cloud the voice says, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." These words were the same ones the disciples knew from 3 years earlier, where another John baptized Jesus. But this time, from the bright cloud, God adds a phrase, a sentence, a command. Listen to him. The word for listen integrates the same idea parents want to communicate when they say to their children, "Listen to me." And we don't just mean with your ears, we also mean with your actions. Listen and obey. Listen to Jesus and obey him. For Moses and Elijah suddenly are gone. So imagine the disciples' experience. Powerful light illuminating Jesus' divine nature to them, the image of their heroes talking with Jesus, a fiery cloud above them, and a powerful voice from within the cloud affirming their leader and commanding them to listen to and obey him. It's no wonder they hit the deck and crouch in fear. The kids are right, they look asleep. But still, Jesus came and touched them and said, "Get up and do not be afraid." So imagine that tender, compassionate touch that speaks even without words. I am aware of your shock, but do not be frightened by what you have seen. Get up. We have places to go. We have things to do together. Now, we can only imagine this awe-inspiring scene, but imagine today. If Jesus were to come beside you and touch you with a compassionate hand, what fear would he ask you to release? I invite you to close your eyes and imagine Jesus sitting beside you, softly speaking your name and saying, "My beloved, do not be afraid of..." What? Do not be afraid of rejection by your peers or your family. Do not be afraid of tryouts and tests. Do not be afraid of being alone. Do not be afraid of what will happen next. Jesus, we each ask you, what fear are you inviting me to release? Amen. Growing up, when my family traveled through foggy mountains, my mom and I would playfully argue. She called it fog, which it was. I called it a cloud. It's fog, she would say. It's a cloud, I would say. Fog, cloud. Now, obviously, it didn't really matter. We were just being silly. But today, on Transfiguration Sunday, I think the clouds are the excitement of the day. They are like the sky coming down to earth, just like God did on Mount Sinai with Moses, and then again on the Mount of Transfiguration. The sky says, listen to Jesus. And then Jesus says, get up and do not be afraid. Get up and do not be afraid. Get up and do not be afraid. Amen.